Hey folks, hope you all are doing well. I'm Karan Bandal from Econosite, and in this video, let's talk about the spending plan of the newly formed government in India and investigate where will the money come from and how are they planning to spend it. Back in February of 2024, the NDA 2.0 government presented the interim budget for the ongoing financial year that ends in March 2025. The new government will soon assume power, which most likely be the NDA 3.0, although with a much smaller majority. They are expected to present the full final budget sometime in July 2024, and if it is going to be the NDA 3.0, the final budget will more or less line up with the interim one. So let's see what kind of firepower the new government is likely to unleash. To begin with, let's talk about top level numbers. I'll state the numbers in US dollars, but on the screen you can also see the numbers in Indian rupees. Now the government plans to spend over $550 billion during the financial year 2025. It is a massive amount. This translates to roughly 47.6 trillion rupees. Here's the conversion into Indian numbering system. 1 trillion rupees is 1 lakh crore rupees. So the central government of India plans to spend 47.6 lakh crore rupees this fiscal. To be able to spend this amount, first the government needs to bring in this kind of money from somewhere. So let's look at the income sources now. Taxes do make up most of the income for the government. If you see, personal income tax that individuals pay, corporate tax that the companies and business houses pay, and goods and services tax that every consumer pays contribute over $125 billion each to the government's tax kitty. Then add in customs and excise taxes and we arrive at the gross tax revenue of over $450 billion or 38.3 lakh crore rupees. But the central government does not get to keep all this money. As part of the federal structure of India, the central government must transfer a portion of the taxes collected to the state governments of India. So, about $145 billion will go to the states. That leaves roughly $310 billion for the central government as net tax revenue. Then there are non-tax revenues also, such as interest receipts, dividend transfers and profits. In the last video, we did talk about how the RBI transferred some $12 billion worth of dividend, more than what the government was expecting. So add in the non-tax revenue and we arrive at the total revenue receipts of roughly $360 billion. This is the money that the Indian government collects from its citizens, state companies, state institutions and private companies. The government wants to spend some $570 billion though. They clearly don't have enough revenue coming in. Now this gap of about $200 billion is what the government has to borrow from the market. And this kind of lines up with India's fiscal deficit. India's fiscal deficit is projected to be around $200 billion or 5.1% of the GDP for the ongoing fiscal year. Now before we dive a little deeper into how India plans to spend the money, here are a few interesting trends. India's tax to GDP ratio did improve in the last 10 years, but it is still quite low at about 11.5%. Compare this to some European countries. It ranges from a low of about 20.7% for Ireland to all the way up to 47.4% in case of Denmark. A higher ratio may imply that the government has more resources to spend on social welfare and a reduced need to borrow. India still has a lot of work to do in expanding the tax net. Having said that, tax collections have certainly improved over the last decade. Since financial year 2015, net receipts have almost tripled in rupee terms and more than doubled in dollar terms. And finally, India's capital expenditure has roughly tripled in rupee terms since financial year 2017. Looking at the major top level expenses, the good news is related to the hard infrastructure. Capital expenditure and grants in aid for the creation of capital assets comes in at the top spot, making up more than 30% of the total spending. This is the value-added spending that ends up creating more roads, ports, airports, railways, etc. The bad news is that interest on the government debt is the second largest expense, making up almost a quarter of the total spending. This goes back to India's low tax to GDP ratio, meaning not enough residents are paying their fair share of taxes, and so the government needs to borrow a large sum of money and ends up paying quite a bit in interest on that debt. Then the third largest expense, the establishment expenditure. This makes up around 15% of the total spending and is needed to keep the government running. Expenses like salaries, office expenses, travel expenses, and other administrative costs fall in this category. The top three spending items together make up more than 70% of the Indian central budget. We are taking a bird's eye view, so these are some key spending areas at a high level. But if you zoom in a bit, look at how little the center is spending on education, health, or scientific departments. Again, I go back to the news of RBI's $12 billion worth of bonus dividend to the center. That dividend can effectively double the education budget or the health budget. Look at some of the centrally sponsored schemes. The allocation for the rural employment guarantee schemes can be doubled with this more than expected RBI dividend. Or through Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, the number of houses to be built for the poor can be doubled. What I am trying to say is that RBI's bumper dividend is not insignificant. It can be put to good use, and the center can do better when it comes to spending on soft infrastructure. Just as the capital expenditure is conducive for the long-term growth prospects of the economy, so is the spending on education, health, research, etc. In summary, India's tax revenue has significantly increased over the past decade, and so has its spending need. The two key points to keep in mind with India's central budget is that the fiscal deficit is a problem. India needs to address this aggressively. On the flip side, India's capital expenditure has been quite impressive for some time now. Let's see if the full budget expected in July of this year brings any surprises or a course correction. I hope you found this analysis interesting. I'll speak with you again next week. Until then, take care.